So this is a TvZ between Snuck and Interceptor in the Silver League, and Snuck has been working on a two-factory Hellion tank push with a Thor follow-up at the same time as you expand. And the glory and the joy of the two-factory push is that in the early game, when you need all that extra gas to get Siege Mode, to get Blue Flame, to get both of the factories, to get the add-ons, having just one factor making tanks allows you to use all of that gas. But then as soon as you stop spending gas on those infrastructural things, your gas starts to pile up if you're just making tanks. And so the build is meant to transition to Thors just at the right time to start using that gas surplus once you have it. And Thors are 200 gas per minute. And a one base double geyser income is 200 gas per minute. So it all works out. I've had trouble in the past doing tank Hellion push with a Thor follow-up because Thors take a full minute to build and then they take forever to cross the field because they're so slow. One difference between the last game is this, the double wall-in. You really want a wall-in that can only be broken at one point so that you can make a secondary wall-in behind that point so that you can't lose to just simple baneling busts. Unfortunately, you could see the indecision right there. Snuck lifted to create this tech lab so that he could swap the factory onto it, and then he realized that if he made the tech lab, it would ruin the wall-in. So what really should have happened is the racks should have been here and the factory should have been here, then the tech lab, and then they could swap. This guy could swap over here so the second factory would be built, completing the wall-in, and then make a reactor up here, and then swap them again, and then you'd end up with the same wall-in, but you wouldn't have an idle factory for so long. So minor build difficulties. The most important part of any build is that at 6 minutes you really need to have 24 workers, so being 2 workers short is a very big deal. But Snuck said, I want you to watch this relatively long game and tell me other things besides the fact that yes, I missed workers and yes, I messed up the build. You'll notice that in the higher leagues, like in Platinum or whatever, or Diamond or Masters or whatever, if somebody goes for a one base strong push, the game never lasts 47 minutes. This is a big symptom of the super low leagues, is that whenever I watch replays from somebody, or whenever I coach people that are in like Silver League or Bronze League, their games are always extremely long, just ridiculously long. And that comes a lot down to the fact that their incomes don't pile up the way that better players' incomes pile up. Let me explain this. When you walk from here, from your base to his base, there's a 1 minute difference. So if you have a $500 a minute army budget, then there's going to be a $500 army difference between when you get there and when you arrive. So that's called the defender's advantage, and in the early game it's very significant because everyone has a very low income. But later on, when you have a $3,000 a minute income, it becomes a lot less significant. You end up with these huge armies, so the fact that you're missing 5 Marines in a tank is no longer nearly as important. I don't know if that even makes sense now that I think more about it. But anyway, I'll stop trying to think about why and just say that in general, people in Bronze and Silver League play ridiculously long games all the time. No one can kill anyone else. So this push is meant to just walk in there and crush face. You're supposed to go with the siege tanks. I believe siege tanks and spine crawlers have exactly the same range, so if you A-move your siege tanks, they'll end up going exactly 7 range away, and then you can pull them back 1 step and put your Hellions behind them the whole time and siege up. Snuck is being ridiculously cautious with this push, which is, I think, one of the strongest suits of Snuck's playstyle, is that he's really good at slow pushing with tanks. Unfortunately, at 9 minutes you want, what is it, 34 workers, and he's on 28, so he's 6 workers behind. And I've noticed missed production on workers throughout the game. He's paying so much attention to doing a careful, slow, safe push that he's losing the whole point of this one base push. So the point of this build is that at 6 minutes you have 24 workers, which is 3 here, and 18 here. That's pretty much soft cap max saturation. So it allows you to really constantly use these two production facilities while also getting the siege mode upgrade. So by being 2 workers short at this point, he's already kind of unable to get siege mode when he wants to, while still affording the next tank. Like, he doesn't have enough money to use these 2 buildings constantly and get siege mode. And then the problem gets exacerbated when he falls further behind on workers and takes 3 workers off to go walk out with the push. So the idea is to extremely quickly get 4 tanks with siege mode and 6 Hellions, and then follow up with 2 more and 2 more, and end up actually at the opponent's base with like 8 Hellions and 4 tanks ridiculously early. And that premise only works if you do the build perfectly. So what's happening is you need siege mode a long time ago. 400 gas, complete waste. Like, that's just a bunch of wasted gas right there. Also, this is the second time you've missed a tank. Like, you need to be constantly making tanks so that when one tank finishes, the next tank starts instantly. It doesn't start later. This should be constantly making workers so that at this point, when you pull 3 workers off, you remember that we said 24 is what you need to have enough income to use these buildings. Well, with, I think, is this? Yeah, with 2 idle workers, 3 workers pulled off, that's 5 workers gone. You only have 21 workers. You don't have enough workers to constantly use these buildings. On top of that, if we camera lock, you are looking over here. This is why your macro is doing terribly, is because you're trying to do Hellion harass so that he doesn't see your push, which is really important. But you shouldn't do that at the expense of using these buildings, because if you don't use these buildings, you lose. Whereas if you don't take the tower with a Hellion, he's going to see your push coming a little bit earlier. That might matter, and it might not. He might be the kind of guy, and he probably is the kind of guy, who's going to do the exact same build no matter what he sees. So taking that watchtower with a Hellion is nice, but it's like 25th down the list compared to making SCVs, making supply depots, using both of these buildings, getting the upgrades, starting your armory, making your command center. Like, there's a lot of stuff you're not doing, and the reason you're not doing it is because you're looking at your army over here. And with siege mode not done and not even on the way, this army over here doesn't need to be looked at. In fact, it doesn't even need to be over here. So also, you're going to mess up on your macro to deny 1 watchtower, but then you're just going to walk right in view of the 2nd watchtower. It's pretty funny. So when we watch the game from your first-person camera, this camera should almost never leave your base, even while you're pushing. What you should do is auto-follow your Hellions onto a tank, rally both your buildings onto a tank, auto-repair your SCVs, right-click them onto the tank, then take the tank and A-move to right here. And then keep looking at your base and keep macroing perfectly. And you've proven through many times that you're capable of macroing perfectly if you're not looking away from your base. So don't look away from your base. Take the practice that you've been doing against me and against the AI and whatever, and do it in real games, man. It doesn't make sense to practice one thing and then do another thing. So when I camera lock, I want to see this camera always in your base until your tanks actually siege up. And that's not what we're gonna see, baby. No, see. So when do you first start falling behind, and when you first start looking away? Moving that Marine to attack that Overlord made you miss this tank. Like, which is more important? Sending 1 Marine to go attack an Overlord, or making the tank? The tank is far more important. You're not allowed to do things like this, minor things that you know you want to do. You got to be able to think of, alright, I want to do this, but I can't until I've macroed. There should be 2 more Hellions queued up here and a tank queued here before you even start to move over there. And you can see these cute little blue lines above your buildings. If the blue line is empty, you're allowed to move your Marines. If the blue line is almost full, you are not allowed to do anything until you queue up that next unit. Same thing here. I believe at this point you've got 3 idle buildings, right? Because you moved that Marine and it made you not macro at the perfect time. And what do you do first? Hellions. Your tank factory has been idle for a while. Your Hellions were actually still building. Why did you do Hellions first? Also, you have very little minerals and very high gas. And what did we say before? You always prioritize gas over minerals because your mineral income is higher. So if you make the tank first, then you'll be able to follow up with Hellions pretty quick. But if you make the Hellions first, you might never get around to making that tank. And any gas you fail to spend when you only have one building capable of spending gas is gas that's just going to be in your bank for the rest of the, not the rest of the game, for a really long time. Also, the next step in your build is going to be a command center. So it's much better to miss Hellions than to miss tanks. If you miss Hellions, that contributes towards your next command center. If you miss tanks, that just gives you gas that you can't spend. But most importantly, when you have 3 idle buildings, CC is always first. Always, always first. And when you finally get around your CC, you did this building, and then this building, and then this building, which is completely the wrong order. It should have been this, and then this, and then this. When you finally do these 2 buildings, you never get to the CC. And now you finally did get to the CC. Anytime you look at your CC and you see that it was idle a second ago, you got to say to yourself, wow, I'm not keeping up on SCVs. I should queue up 3 or 4 of them. You know? You should have queued up 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 SCVs. And it's easy to say, if I queue up 2 SCVs, I won't be able to afford the next 2 Hellions, right? Because I only have exactly 200 million minerals. I'd miss Hellions if I queue up SCVs. But remember, at this point, at 7 minutes, you're supposed to have exactly 27 workers. And you have 24. So you've missed so many SCVs that it's added up to 3 full SCVs behind. And that's reducing your mineral income. You know that a 1 base Terran's mineral income is going to be 1,000, right? So you actually have a $200 per minute less every minute. You're not just going to miss 2 Hellions if you don't queue up SCVs. You're going to miss 2 Hellions every single minute. So it's much more important to queue up a crap ton of SCVs and just never miss SCVs than it is to say, well, I should try to get away with only 1 SCV queued up because that'll allow me to build this next tank or these next 2 Hellions. It's much more important to not miss workers. So again, you have 2 idle buildings. You have to choose which one to use. Let's see what you choose. You choose to click on your tanks, lower your depots, and start your push. You should never lower your depots and start your push if you have idle buildings. Again, if your push is 30 seconds late, it could be bad. But if you miss workers, you're going to lose the whole game. If you miss production out of this building, gas is going to pile up forever, and that's just going to make you much worse at your push. So in general, this push will be stronger if you delay it in order to make sure that you've queued stuff up as you're pushing out. Let's watch your camera again. All of your buildings are idle at this point. You decide to move your army and then try to macro up while looking at your army. Looks like right now you're clearing the tower, you're making sure not to take any damage from this Ling. Again, you're doing things that are not macro. So your macro is slipping more and more as you watch this Hellion. That doesn't make any sense. Again, even if you lose the Hellion because you weren't looking, it's better to lose the Hellion than to be so far behind. At this point, it's 8 minutes in, and you should have 30 workers. You're short 4. You should have probably 5 tanks and 8 Hellions, and you have 3 tanks and 4 Hellions. You should also definitely have siege tech. All this money in the bank is money that should have been more army. But on top of that, you should have more money than this because of the worker shortage. And I know you told me not to focus so much on the economy, but I'm telling you, this is why you lost this game. It has nothing to do with what happened later on. And talking about what happened later on is going to give you the impression that it's important, because there's lots of stuff I can probably say about how you handled your positioning, what composition you got when you took your third, that kind of stuff. But if you can't do this right, you're never going to beat a guy in the Masters League or even in the Gold League or whatever. So why does it matter how you should position your troops or which composition you should go for or anything like that if you can't get the macro perfect? Like there's tiers of importance, and the very first tier, SCVs, if you're not doing that perfectly, the entire game is invalidated. So right now, no SCV queuing up over and over and over and over. It's like you always queue up either 1 SCV or 2. This is a big mistake. This is something that is important in the Grand Masters League, but is very detrimental in the lower leagues.
Research.
Like, you know that it's really important not to miss SCVs. You know it. You've been told it a bajillion times and whatever. But you're not accepting your own weakness. You're not accepting that you're gonna miss SCVs. And you can never miss SCVs just by queuing up to 5, man. If you'd queued up to 5 by now, you'd have 37 workers instead of 29. That's a huge number more. So at this point, the reason that he mops up this push is not because he saw it coming, like he had the sling on the watchtower. It's not because you had bad positioning. You had good positioning. You were fine. What it's due to is just your army size. It's 10 minutes, and we know how big your army is supposed to be at 10 minutes, right? 3,500 or 4,000 on a one base. This is a ridiculously late expansion, which means you're basically one basing, which means you should have an almost $4,000 army. And these buildings have been idle for so long, and you've been behind on workers for so long, that you're just... This is almost what you pushed out with at 7 minutes, right? Let's see. Okay, when this tank pops, it's 7 minutes, and you have 3 tanks and 4 Hellions. Okay? 3 tanks and 4 Hellions at 7 minutes. So when the fight starts, how much more than that do you have? Almost nothing else. This is what you had at 7 minutes. It's 3 minutes later, and you've added 1 tank and 2 Hellions. 1 production cycle. Ridiculous. So you do pretty well in that fight, but imagine how much better you would have done if you'd actually had a $3,500 army instead of a $2,000 army, right? You would have had almost double the army size. So there's something you gotta know about Zerg in general, is that they don't produce units in the same teeny tiny steady flow that Terran produces units. Like if a Terran gets siege tanks and Hellions camped outside your base, you suicide your army into it, and he kills your army, you're going to be producing like 4 Marines every 30 seconds, and they're going to walk down and just die, and it's not going to work. But Zergs, because of larva inject, they produce about, let's see, about $1,000 of army every time they produce any army. So they're going to have nothing, 1,000, nothing, 2,000. It's very different than the way Terran macro works, and it means that if you do a push and then you aren't instantly killing his drones, you're going to die to the mop-up, because your reinforcements are not going to be anywhere near as plentiful as his reinforcements. So when you do a push, ask yourself, can I immediately push from here and kill drones, or should I go home? Those are like the only 2 options, unless you still have 3 or 4 tanks left at the end. And when you get a 9-minute command center, you should almost always be pushing forward and trying to kill drones, trying to stop mining. Because if you get some Hellions behind here, he's going to transfer his drones away, and even if you don't kill him, he's not mining anymore. That's really important. So at this point, you're ridiculously far behind, but again, you guys are both in the Silver League. It's not like just you are in the Silver League. So he is making lots of mistakes. He's just pushed you back, secured map control. He's taking a third, which is the right move, but to only have 44 workers and no second and third gas is a big deal. But more importantly, this is a huge deal. He's got way too many drones on his main, not enough drones down here. I shouldn't be coaching your enemy, but I should just say that, you know, the follow-up to that push, 13 minutes in to have 32 workers, you should definitely throw this game in the trash. This is ridiculous. So worker benchmarks are important, man, and I told you before you sent me this game, watch your own games and look at the army size and worker benchmarks, and if you're not hitting them, don't send me the replay. And I'm not saying that to be mean. I know you want to hear about how good your 45-minute fight right before the end of the game was and how well you handled your drops at 32 minutes in, but the game would never have lasted that long if you didn't have these problems. So anyway, 10 minutes in, 29 workers. You're shooting for 44 against Zerg, 37 off of one base if you're one basing, which you are. What is it? What's 33% behind on workers at this point. Pretty darn far behind, in fact. Yeah. That was good. You totally took my advice. You sent the Hellions behind the minerals and then sent them back. Stops mining for a little while. So your follow-up is going to be Thor Hellion, but your production is really gimped by the fact that you're basically not mining because you have no workers. Off of 2 bases, you should be looking for 2,400 at about, what was it? Like, about 10 minutes, maybe 10.5 minutes. And you're getting 1,200, so about half. And you remember I was saying you should be able to spend all your money off with 2 factories until you get a second base, and then after a while you should go up to 5 factories. I don't like this starport. I don't think you ever need a starport. The thing is, you're planning for a really late game, but you don't need to be. I don't think you should be. I think it's hurting you to get so much practice at a bad late game instead of practicing what's really important, which is keeping your macro perfect. So again, if we're looking at your camera, you're looking out here, and in your base, lots of idle stuff, lots of idle stuff, lots of idle stuff. This is consistent throughout the whole game. This is not just a problem in the early game, you know? And I think the reason that you're so good at slow pushing with tanks and positioning your army properly and choosing the right composition and knowing how to use it is because you've practiced that a lot. You've practiced staring at your army and moving it around the right way. And so you're not going to lose that skill if you stop doing it for a week or 2 weeks or a month. It's all the things you've learned about how to properly position and how to micro your troops, it's going to stay there. So I would really stop doing it, man. Stare at your base and focus only on macro for a month until you get promoted 2 leagues. So throwing down another armory to increase the upgrades a little bit more. Notice how when you're looking at your base, you're able to easily spend all your money. It's only when you're looking away that you're screwing everything up. But again, so you're moving your army around, and then you say, alright, I've got a lull, I'm going to go home and macro. Let's look at when you look at your base and talk about the priorities again. You are moving your army around. Okay, I probably don't need to be moving my army around. I'm going to look back at my base, make some depots, do some stuff. What did you do first? Tanks, Thors, Hellions, Tech Lab. SCVs are first, man. SCVs are first. You should make like a rule in your mind that you're never allowed to build anything in any building unless you built SCVs right beforehand. You know? It's not like they're not separate things. They should be the same in your mind. It should be a ritual. If you want to make a Thor right now, 4SS 5T. You know, you start with the SCVs and then you make that Thor. That's like if you think to yourself, all right, I got to remember to macro, that should instantly translate into I got to make more workers and then other stuff. So you're doing the workers last. You're queuing up stuff in these buildings and then going over here to make sure that you have SCVs, and that's bad. Because the workers, 17 seconds, 17 seconds. When you double queue workers, it's going to be done in 30 seconds. This one Thor with a tank queued up behind it, this isn't going to need you to pay attention to it for another 2 full minutes almost. And this double siege tank, not going to need your attention for a really long time. You got to get used to the fact that things take a different amount of time to happen, and the SCVs take the least amount of time, so they need the most amount of attention. Or, like I said before, just queue up to max, man. You would win so much more often if you just held down the S key until all 5 slots were filled. Because at this point, you remember the spreadsheet with all of our cute little math? Let's look. Let's look. I think you've memorized the benchmarks, but I haven't memorized all of them. So, 15 minutes. Docs.google.com. So this is basically a really late expansion build. So there's a little bit of give. You got to say, I'm going to be a little bit behind on money because I'm going to have stayed on one base for so long. But you should be able to at least hit the one base benchmark, and probably hit the one base benchmark plus about 2,000 from that expo, or maybe 1,000 or something like that. So the 15-minute, like the most you can get should be, if you trade armies, it should be with the 3OC is like you already have 9,000 a minute beforehand, so you should be able to get like 10 or 11,000. You have 5,000. Obviously, that's not nearly 11,000, but the normal one base standard benchmark is 8,500, and you're 3,000 below that. And it's all just because of missing workers, man. I'm telling you, Brohan. So again, let's look at your camera and find out why you're messing up your macro. It's the same exact reason. You're moving your army around, and as you move your army from here to here, you're staring at it. And that's an extremely good habit to get into in Masters League. That's something that I have trouble remembering to do. And it's a good Grandmaster talent. This is a suggestion you'll hear from people in the Grandmasters League all the time. Like, well, when you're moving your army, make sure you're staring at it because you don't want to bumble into some banelings and die. This is a terrible thing to hear when you're in Silver League because this is not what you should be spending your attention on. So let's look at your base. Alright, so before you move your army, you queued up a bunch of stuff like you're supposed to. That's good. Now we stare at this army, and we watch down here these pips disappear. So now you've moved your army across the field. You're no longer making Hellions, you're no longer making air units. You're no longer making SCVs. Pretty soon you're not going to be making anything, right? This Thor takes forever to build, man. That's what I really think that Thor type builds are going to be good for you, is because, okay, you're no longer making tanks. It's because you have this problem of idle buildings, right? You have no buildings building, but more importantly than even the fact that you're not using any buildings is the fact, look again, you're like, oh yeah, I'm not using my buildings. So you queue up a bunch of Thors, but only 2 Hellions. That should be 6 or 8 Hellions, because when you queue up 2 tanks, this is a minute and a half. When you queue up 2 Hellions, this is 30 seconds. So if you want this to be a minute and a half and this to be a minute and a half, you say 2 tanks, 6 Hellions. Minute and a half for both of them. Good. But yeah, you are doing your army before your workers. You're like, okay, I need to do this, and you just put them in the wrong order. No workers still, no workers still. Staring at your army, no workers still. So yeah, same problem throughout the game. But your money is piling up, and do you know why your money is piling up? You don't have enough buildings. Why do you not have enough buildings? Because you're not staring at your base and thinking exclusively about how do I spend all of my money. If that was the only thing you were thinking about, and when you attacked you weren't paying so much attention to it, you would have noticed 2 or 3 cycles ago that you needed more buildings. Or in fact, if you'd been keeping up constant production, you probably wouldn't even need more buildings because you would have been spending that money easily. But yeah, the Hellions are going to stop. The SCVs are going to stop, and then the tanks are going to stop. Because of the asymmetry of the way you're queuing up stuff as you stare at your army, you're overbuilding gas units. And this is the problem that we've mentioned a bunch of times. Usually if we load up any replay of yours and we look at late on in the game, you have a ton of minerals and no gas. And that's because you're keeping constant production of these heavy gas units and not keeping constant production of SCVs and Hellions. And that's like the opposite of what you want to happen. Obviously, if you have to cut anything, cutting Hellions is the right choice, and that's fine. But cutting SCVs is always the wrong choice, and cutting infrastructure is quite bad. So now again, you're staring at your army, and your starport has been idle all game. You don't even have an air unit. Like, this is why I said I didn't like that starport as conceptually. Like, it's probably been around for 8 minutes, and you're making your first air unit right now. Like, I don't know. I don't think you need starports. Keep it simple, man. Keep it simple. It's much easier to play when all you have is factories. Much, much easier. So these, look how idle your command centers always are. And then you finally remember and you make 2 SCVs. in 17 game seconds, they're going to be idle again. Like, you need to make 10 SCVs. Anyway, to be 20 minutes in with only 58 workers is quite bad, but you're already up to 58, so you don't really need a ton more SCVs. This fight is great for you, by the way, positioning-wise. You have your tanks so that when he gets onto the ramp, they'll start taking damage. But when you think about it, because you can't see to this high ground, because you don't have any air units... Where's this rallied? It makes more sense to have your tanks positioned so that they start firing right here, so that they're further away, so the roaches can't reach them. But it doesn't matter. You won this fight significantly, and that's great. But TvZ, the dynamic of TvZ is that once Zerg gets tier 3, they kind of win unless you have a huge economic lead before that happens. So in TvZ, what you want is 5 bases, completely uncontestable, when he's on 5 bases 2 or something. But if he gets up to 3 bases and you're on 3 bases, that's kind of bad for him. Especially now that you're knocking down this base, I'd say you're definitely ahead at this point. But usually at 16 minutes is when they're going to start their tier 3, and Broodlords would kind of rip your army to shreds. Also, you lost all your Hellions in that push, and remember what I said before, not during this cast, but before when I was emailing you and talking to you. Every fight, first thing that's going to happen is you're going to lose all your Hellions. So as soon as you start a fight, you want to just spam Hellions, because they're the quickest unit you have, so they're going to get to the fight quick enough to actually make a difference. Whereas if you make a Thor, it's going to be 2 minutes before he gets to the fight. It's not going to be a factor. But also, you need the Hellions to be alive, or else Broodlings and Drones and Lings can just kind of rip your army to shreds. So, yeah. At this point, you're on 3 base versus his 2 base, but you're taking your third at like 22 minutes. You haven't made it a planetary yet. You're basically not mining at it. You're completely mined out at your main, but all your workers are still up there doing nothing. There's like, if you weren't fighting and all you had to do was look at your base, you would have the proper number of workers here. You would have a planetary or an orbital here. You would be using these properly. You would be getting these upgrades. Like, you've made double armories. 20 minutes in, it's probably been 16 minutes since you made the second armory. You haven't even started the second upgrade. So either don't make 2 armories or use the ones you have or something. What else? This is the only base that's properly saturated, just so you know. Also, you've gone into triple starport. I'm really confused by this mass Banshee with some Hellion stuff, because 1 Banshee is crazy good against infestors. 10 Banshees is pretty bad. Infestors, it takes them like 120 energy to deal with 1 Banshee, but it takes them like 200 energy to deal with 20 Banshees. It's, you know, you want a small number of Banshees constantly coming in off of 1 starport, not 3 starport with lots of Banshees. That doesn't make any sense. Also, the later into the game you go, the more likely it is he's going to get Corruptors for Broodlords. So Banshees become much less useful once that happens. Also, your income throughout the entire game has never really been higher than 1,200. You want, at 6 minutes, you want to have a $1,200 income, right? You're below that by about 200. At 10 minutes, let's see. Like, my point is that your income is supposed to continually grow throughout the game, but in your games it stays the same, and this is very consistent across all of the lower league games I watch of anyone. And I know that you have different strong points than Tom, for example, and different weak points and whatever, and everyone's different, but it's not a coincidence that everyone's games go long and that everybody always has the same general infrastructural money spending, SCV creating problems in the lower leagues. That's kind of what defines a Silver League player. And if you haven't seen that the Team Liquid Do You Macro Like a Pro post, you should totally read this. A guy analyzed a bajillion games and just plotted the number game duration divided by number of workers created, and then merged that with the unspent minerals throughout over time, and then merged that with your leagues, and found that just basically workers created divided by game duration is organized like this: bronze is lowest, silver, gold, platinum. Like it's an obvious scale. It just goes up obviously. All you need to be a grandmaster compared to a bronze player is a heck of a lot more workers, you know. So yeah, I'm not alone when I say this stuff. Anyway, so if we open the income tab and we look, if I click here, it should say 1,000. If I click here, it should say 2,000. And if I click anything later than here, it should always be at least 3,000. Like for the rest of the game, you should always be around 3,000. And it's not. It's 1,500, 1,600. And it's going to stay 1,600. That's actually going to go lower and then rise back up again and go lower. Like if we could plot this on a graph, it would be consistently about 1,500 from the 15-minute point on, which is half what your income should be from the 15-minute mark on. And in order to maintain a $3,000 income, you need 3 active bases, which means at about 15 minutes you need to be taking your 4th because your main is running dry, and at probably 18 or 20 minutes you need to be taking your 5th because your natural is running dry, and so on and so forth. You have the right number of workers, you have the wrong number of active mineral patches and active geysers. Like a lot of your workers can't do anything. And you do realize eventually that you need more bases, but this is probably 10 or 15 minutes later than you should have been making your 4th base. And I don't, again, this isn't a skill you need to be building up right now. You need to first learn how to make constant workers and supply depots, and second, learn how to constantly spend money at the bases you have, and third, learn to manage your base, make enough production facilities at the right times. And after that, when you expo is kind of important, but your games should never last this long until you're playing against Platinum League or Diamond League players with your already existing micro abilities and a really good economy. You'll just never get to the late game. Leads snowball much more significantly when your income is huge, right? Because if you have a $3,000 income instead of a $2,000 income and you lose this army, then you're going to instantly replenish it and go again. Whereas if both players have this teeny tiny income, it's, you know, they're both afraid they need to protect their 3 little bases, their 20 little drones, and games just last forever. Your games shouldn't last this long, man. So that last fight, the basic problem was just Zerg tier 3 beats Terran. I mean, it's kind of an accepted rule of Terran-ness, is that if you don't have an income lead or an army size lead and you don't see what's coming next, you're just gonna lose the first time you see tier 3. Surprise, Broodlord's gonna kill you. Because it takes entirely different composition and you know, stuff to beat roaches and infestors than it does to beat broodlords and infestors. You can't move in underneath the broodlords because infestors will prevent it and all that kind of stuff. So you've been making a smattering of this really, really well-balanced mech composition, and suddenly broodlords are like the counter to mech, and he comes out with a bunch of broodlords. You have 0 Vikings, and you just lose the army to broodlords. And there's nothing you could have done better about this. It's not like it's your fault. This is always going to happen, and usually it should have happened at 16 or 18 minutes instead of 26. So you just count yourself lucky that you lasted this long before you did the transition into really good units. And the reason that broodlord centric armies will tend to beat mech centric armies, it's not so much compositionally that broodlords are better than blah 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 blah. A big part of it is that if you look at the army size, he's 14 supply below you, but his army is bigger. It's $800 bigger. So when it's 200 versus 200, it'll be even more bigger. So a big problem is that you don't have all of your troops in the battle, obviously. Whenever you want to know why you lost a battle, first you check army sizes. Was my army ridiculously small? No, it was a reasonable size. Was I out-upgraded? Yes, you were out-upgraded, but not unrecoverably out-upgraded. Was my composition stupid against his composition? Yes and no. Thor Hellion does really good against Roach, Infestor, Broodlord, Corruptor. But you need to have the Hellions behind the Thors so that they never take any damage, because they need to be sitting there constantly killing the Broodlings without ever getting hit. If you trade blow for blow Hellion versus Broodling, eventually you won't have any Hellions left, and Thors and tanks will be shooting at Broodlings, which is just a massive waste of your DPS. Next thing you gotta look is composition. You just don't have enough Vikings. There's no way to beat this with what you have. I said with composition you had a reasonable composition, and then I said composition you had a bad composition. That's kind of funny. These Banshees, utterly useless in this scenario. Again, I love one Banshee, I hate 4 Banshees. So he wins this fight, like, phenomenally. You should, again, if you're wondering how you could have beaten his army with your army, the unit tester is your friend, man. Take his army and fight your army. But you were attacking into his hatchery, so your units were badly positioned and not all shooting at the units instead of building. You had a lot of money that was spent on army, but that army was not present in the fight. You had a 1/1 upgrade disadvantage, and then just compositionally, this force is ridiculously hard to deal with without a bunch of Vikings, and probably Viking upgrades and stuff. Honestly, he has more money than you, and he's on Broodlord tech. You lose, kind of. I mean, I know that both of you are unable to finish off the game, so you're not just going to instantly lose right here, but if this were a game that I was playing, this would be the end of it. This would be the last thing that happened in the game. Because he can just walk over and kill all your bases with his Broodlords, and there's nothing you can do about it until you have so many Vikings that you can not only kill his Corruptors, but also kill his Broodlords without getting all fungal growth, and I don't know. It's ridiculous. You just, on 4 Vikings at a time, you'll never be able to make enough to outdo his production of Corruptors. So he's not going to attack, he's going to wait for 200U. But, I mean, have you ever lost a game by 6,000? I lost one battle by 6,000 and then won the game. It doesn't happen very often. Watching the rest of this game seems like kind of a waste of time. But you told me to watch the whole thing, man. I'll do it this once, but from now on, if you don't have enough workers at 6 and 10 minutes, don't send it to me. Because all this cool stuff that's happening now with these big battles and all these composition questions and positioning questions, and talking even about how tier 3 Zerg is really hard to beat with mech compositions or with any composition, it's all irrelevant compared to what a huge advantage or disadvantage you're at just by not having nearly enough money. You remember when we said we can take a calculator? I like calculators, just so you know. Okay, so what we do is we say 7, probably like 29,000 with upgrades, and we subtract 3,500, which is what you should have had at 10 minutes, and then we divide by 23 minutes. Yep, you've gotten about $1,000 per minute on average from 10 minutes until now. Isn't that cool? So like I was saying before, this number should be higher. In the super late game, you should be working off of $3,000 a minute, not 1,000. And you've had 1,200 most of the time. But so is your opponent. In StarCraft, I think everyone will always have room for improvement in every category, and obviously you do have room for improvement on choosing which units to make and how to position them and stuff, but you have very little room for improvement in those categories. When you and I go on the unit map tester and we make equal-sized armies, you're able to beat me at least half the time, which means that your micro is fine, and your positioning is fine, and your knowledge of what needs to be done is fine. So focusing exclusively or focusing so heavily on those aspects of your game is not the bang for the buck is so low now. The better you get at something, the less bang for the buck there is at practicing it. What you're really gonna get the most bang for the buck for is economy. Hey, dude, let's do this thing. Wait, we can't. Yeah, we can. Okay, so we quit the replay and we load up your profile. Dun dun dun, view profile. You said OP and gay in the same sentence. That makes you a bad player. Match history. So we're looking for a 30-something minute long TvZ. Here it is, Interceptor versus Snuck. And we go into economy and we say game length. So he's saying game length divided by workers created at a 47 minute. He doesn't even have a 47-minute game. It's like not even reasonable. Your game is so long that it doesn't even count as a real game. But let's pretend that you had a 30-minute game. Well, let's see. If 20 minutes is 80 workers and 30 minutes is 100 workers, then 50 minutes should be 150 workers. So let's look. Workers created 82. Huh? See? You're about half. You're half the number of workers that you should have created. And then there's the calculator, right? Ooh, let's look at the bottom. No, not that. Boop. And the calculator represents army spend, the amount of money you have in your bank logarithmically divided by the length of the game or something, or by, and somehow, no, not the length of the game, the average income, because average income increases throughout the game, so a longer game will have a higher average income. In theory, obviously it doesn't really. So in this game, 2,900. 1683. Oh, 41 SQ. So a reasonable SQ is 80 and a really good SQ is 100. And this is 41. Pretty bad. And it shows you average resource collection. Is this per minute? Per in-game minute? 1683. Not bad. Let's look at... I wish that it had game duration as one of these columns. It's so annoying to like not be able to just find a long game. I think this is a long game. I think this is a long game. Yeah, 29 minutes. And 2,133, much higher. And in 15 minutes less time, I created the same number of workers, and just generally, you know, same general idea. So these are the things you should really be looking at. The how do I beat broodlords are OP sentiment that you were expressing is not a sentiment that should ever even enter your mind, because your game should end before that. If you do the build perfectly, the game should end long before that. Yeah, dude. And those are concerns for a later league, you know. Oh, this is the wrong one. I wanted to go back to back. Uh-oh, it doesn't let me go back to the score screen of your game.